My name is Daniel Mercer, and this happened in October of 2021 when I accepted a photography assignment deep in the Appalachian Mountains. At the time, I was desperate for money. My freelance work had dried up, my apartment rent was overdue, and I was trying to prove to my younger brother Tyler that I could finally get my life together. When an old hiking magazine offered me a decent paycheck to photograph abandoned locations along Blackwood Trail, I accepted without thinking twice. Tyler insisted on coming with me. He was 19, stubborn, and obsessed with urban exploration videos online. He thought abandoned cabins were exciting. I thought they were just easy money. The locals at the nearest gas station became strangely quiet when I mentioned Blackwood Trail. An old man behind the counter stared at me for several seconds before muttering, "If you see lights in the woods, don't follow them." At the time, I laughed it off. I really wish I hadn't. Blackwood Trail was worse than I expected. The deeper we drove into the mountains, the more the world seemed to disappear behind us. Cell service vanished first. Then the paved roads ended. Eventually, even the GPS froze on a blank screen. Rain started falling just before sunset. Tyler kept joking around, trying to lighten the mood, but I noticed he kept glancing nervously into the trees. The forest felt wrong. Not quiet exactly, but watchful. About 5 miles into the trail, we found the first cabin. It leaned crookedly against the hillside, half swallowed by vines and moss. The roof had partially collapsed, and the windows were covered with black plastic from the inside. What bothered me most was the front porch. There were fresh, muddy footprints leading up the steps. "Someone's living here," Tyler whispered. I wanted to leave immediately, but then we noticed the light. A faint yellow glow flickered behind the plastic-covered window, and suddenly, the rain stopped completely. Tyler wanted to knock on the cabin door. I told him absolutely not. Every instinct in my body screamed that we needed to leave, but curiosity has a dangerous way of overpowering fear, especially when you're standing in the middle of nowhere with rain-soaked clothes and a camera worth more than your truck. As I lifted my camera to photograph the cabin, something moved behind the plastic-covered window. Not a shadow. A face. It appeared for less than a second, pale and stretched unnaturally thin, with hollow eyes reflecting the yellow light inside. I stumbled backwards so fast I nearly slipped off the porch steps. "Did you see that?" I whispered. Tyler nodded slowly, his face drained of color. Before either of us could react, the cabin door creaked open by itself. The smell hit us instantly. Rotting wood, mildew, and something metallic underneath it, like old blood. Inside, the cabin looked strangely untouched. There was an oil lamp burning on a table beside a plate of fresh meat, and hanging above the fireplace were dozens of missing person photographs. Tyler stepped inside before I could stop him. The floorboards groaned beneath our boots as the oil lamp flickered harder, throwing strange shadows across the walls. Every photograph above the fireplace showed hikers, campers, and travelers from different decades. Some pictures looked recent. Others were faded almost beyond recognition. Then Tyler froze. One of the photographs had been taken only 3 years earlier. It showed a woman standing beside this exact cabin. On the bottom corner, written in black marker, were the words, "She heard the whistling." I suddenly remembered the old man at the gas station, warning us about lights in the woods. My chest tightened as I realized something else. The forest outside had become completely silent. No wind, no insects, nothing. Then we heard it. A low whistling sound drifting through the trees beyond the cabin. Slow, uneven, almost human but not quite right. Tyler moved toward the window carefully, but the moment he looked outside, his entire body stiffened. "There's somebody out there," he whispered. And then the whistling stopped directly outside the front door. The front porch creaked. Heavy footsteps moved slowly across the wood outside, circling the cabin without urgency, as if whoever, or whatever, was out there already knew we had nowhere to run. Tyler grabbed a rusted fireplace poker while I searched desperately for another exit. That was when I noticed a narrow hallway leading deeper into the cabin. At the far end sat a wooden door covered with chains and dozens of carved symbols scratched directly into the walls around it. The whistling returned. Closer this time. It came from directly outside the living room window beside me. I turned carefully toward the glass and nearly screamed. A tall figure stood motionless in the rain. Its body looked human, but its arms hung too long, nearly reaching its knees. Its face was hidden beneath a filthy hood, yet I could still see an unnatural grin stretching beneath the fabric. Then it tilted its head sharply sideways and mimicked Tyler's voice perfectly. "Daniel, open the door." Tyler's terrified expression told me immediately. He hadn't spoken. Tyler backed away so fast he knocked over the oil lamp. Flames briefly spilled across the wooden table before dying out, plunging the cabin into near darkness. Only the weak moonlight leaking through the plastic-covered windows remained. Outside, the figure began circling the cabin again. Its footsteps dragged unevenly through the mud, accompanied by that horrible whistling sound that seemed to come from every direction at once. I pulled Tyler toward the chained door at the end of the hallway, thinking maybe we could barricade ourselves inside until morning. But as we approached, we noticed something horrifying. The chains had been broken recently. Fresh splinters littered the floor beneath the doorframe. Someone, or something, had come out. Tyler slowly pushed the door open while I held my flashlight toward the darkness below. Wooden stairs descended into a narrow basement hidden beneath the cabin. The smell rising from below was unbearable. Rotting meat mixed with damp earth. Then my flashlight beam landed on the wall. Hundreds of tally marks had been carved into the wood, and beneath them, written in shaky handwriting, were the words, "It only comes when you hear it whistle." Tyler wanted to leave immediately, but the moment we turned toward the front door, something slammed against the cabin from outside hard enough to shake the walls. Dust rained from the ceiling. The whistling stopped. For several seconds, everything became completely silent again. Then came another sound. Scratching. Long, deliberate scratches dragging slowly across the outside walls of the cabin. Whatever was out there wasn't trying to break in anymore. It was playing with us. Tyler whispered that we should make a run for the truck, but I knew we'd never reach it. The cabin sat nearly 50 yards from the trail, surrounded by dense forest and thick fog rolling between the trees. Then we heard another voice outside. Mine. "Tyler, help me." Every hair on my arm stood up instantly. The thing outside had copied me perfectly. Tyler looked ready to panic as the fake voice repeated itself from somewhere behind the cabin. Suddenly, the flashlight flickered toward the basement stairs again, revealing muddy footprints leading upward from below. Fresh footprints. Something else was already inside the cabin with us. Tyler grabbed my arm so hard it hurt, as we slowly backed away from the basement entrance. The muddy footprints stretched across the hallway floor and disappeared into the darkness near the kitchen. Then we heard breathing. Not outside. Inside the cabin. Slow, wet breathing coming from somewhere, only a few feet away. My flashlight shook violently as I swept it toward the kitchen doorway. At first, I saw nothing. Then the beam caught movement near the ceiling. Something impossibly thin clung upside down above the doorway like a spider, its limbs bent at unnatural angles, and its pale skin looked stretched tightly across its bones. The hood it wore hung loosely over a face that barely looked human anymore. But the eyes were completely black. Tyler screamed and swung the fireplace poker as the creature dropped to the floor with a sickening crack of bones. Instead of attacking immediately, it simply stared at us with that same twisted grin, and then it began whistling from inside the cabin. The sound of that whistling broke something inside me. It echoed through the cabin walls, low and uneven, almost hypnotic. Tyler stumbled backward in panic, while the creature moved toward us slowly, twitching with sharp, unnatural jerks, like its bones were constantly snapping back into place. I grabbed Tyler and ran for the front door. The moment we burst outside, freezing rain slammed into us again. Fog swallowed the trail almost completely, reducing visibility to only a few feet. Behind us, the cabin door creaked open slowly. The creature didn't chase us immediately. That somehow made it worse. We sprinted toward the truck, slipping through mud and wet leaves. Tyler was crying now, barely able to breathe as the whistling drifted through the woods around us from multiple directions. Then the truck came into view, and my stomach dropped. Every window had been smashed from the inside outward. Across the side of the truck, written in thick mud, were the words, "It knows your voices now." Behind us, branches cracked loudly in the darkness. Something was moving through the trees beside us. Tyler jumped into the truck while I fumbled desperately for the keys with shaking hands. The entire forest around us had come alive with movement. Shapes darted between the trees too quickly to identify, accompanied by distant whistling echoing from every direction. The engine finally started. For one brief second, I thought we were going to survive. Then Tyler froze beside me. "Daniel," he whispered weakly. I turned toward him slowly. Something was sitting in the back seat. At first, all I could see were long, pale fingers wrapped around the headrest behind Tyler. Then the hooded face leaned forward from the darkness between us. Its black eyes reflected in the windshield, while that impossible grin widened slowly. And then it spoke in my mother's voice. "Don't leave me here." I slammed the truck into reverse and sped blindly down Blackwood Trail. We crashed through trees, nearly drove off cliffs, and somehow reached the highway before sunrise. But Tyler never spoke again after that night. Not once, and sometimes, late at night, I still hear whistling outside my apartment window. My name is Rebecca Hayes, and this happened during the winter of 2018, when my fiancé Ethan and I rented an abandoned hunting cabin deep in the Appalachian Mountains near Hollow Creek. At the time, our relationship was falling apart. Ethan wanted us to disconnect from the world for a few days and fix things before our wedding. I agreed, mostly because I was afraid of losing him. The cabin had belonged to Ethan's grandfather decades earlier, but nobody in his family had stayed there since the late 1980s. According to Ethan, his grandfather suddenly abandoned the property without explanation and refused to speak about it ever again. The drive there felt endless. Snow covered the narrow mountain roads, and the deeper we traveled into the forest, the darker the world became. The trees looked dead, twisted like giant black hands reaching toward the sky. When we finally arrived, the cabin stood alone beside a frozen creek. And even before stepping out of the car, I noticed someone watching us from the woods. I asked Ethan if he saw the figure near the tree line, but by the time he turned around, it was gone. He brushed it off immediately, blaming my nerves and the long drive. But the feeling of being watched only grew stronger as we unpacked our bags and carried supplies into the cabin. The place smelled like damp wood and ash. Inside, everything looked frozen in time. Old hunting rifles hung above the fireplace, dusty family photographs covered the walls, and a rusted lantern still sat on the dining table exactly where someone had left it decades earlier. Then I noticed something strange. Every single window in the cabin had thick iron locks installed from the inside. Not outside. Inside. Ethan finally admitted his grandfather used to claim that something walked near Hollow Creek at night. According to family stories, locals called it the Watcher. Supposedly, if you saw it staring into your windows, you were never supposed to look back twice. I laughed nervously at the story. Then, outside the cabin, something heavy crunched slowly through the snow. Ethan grabbed one of the old rifles from above the fireplace and stepped toward the front window carefully. Snow blew violently outside now, covering most of the frozen creek in white mist. For several seconds, neither of us saw anything. Then Ethan froze. "There's somebody near the trees," he whispered. I moved beside him slowly and looked through the frost-covered glass. At first, I thought it was just another tree trunk swaying in the storm. But then it moved. A tall figure stood near the edge of the woods across the creek. It was impossibly still. Even through the snowfall, I could tell something about its body looked wrong. Its arms hung unnaturally low, and its head seemed tilted at an angle no human neck should allow. Ethan opened the cabin door and shouted toward it. The figure didn't react. It simply remained there, watching us silently from the storm. Then the lantern inside the cabin suddenly went out on its own, plunging half the room into darkness. And when I looked back toward the creek, the figure was gone. The power died completely an hour later. Outside, the storm intensified until the cabin walls groaned under the wind. Ethan tried starting the generator behind the cabin, but after 10 minutes he came rushing back inside, pale and shaken. "There are footprints around the house," he said breathlessly. "What kind of footprints?" He hesitated. "Bare feet." That made no sense. Snow covered the ground in thick layers, and the temperature had dropped well below freezing hours ago. Ethan locked the door immediately, while I relit the lantern with trembling hands. Then we heard knocking. 3 slow knocks against the cabin wall beside the kitchen, not the front door, the wall itself. We both turned toward the sound as another 3 knocks echoed through the wood. Slowly, Ethan approached the window nearest the kitchen sink and wiped away the frost covering the glass. The moment he looked outside, his face lost all color. I asked him what he saw, but he didn't answer. He only whispered one sentence. "It's standing right next to the cabin." I slowly moved toward the kitchen window beside Ethan, barely able to breathe. At first, all I could see through the frost-covered glass was swirling snow and darkness. Then the face appeared. It stood inches from the window. The thing outside looked vaguely human, but its skin was pale gray and stretched tightly over sharp bones. Its eyes were completely black, reflecting the lantern light inside the cabin like wet glass. Snow clung to its shoulders and long, tangled hair, yet it didn't seem affected by the freezing storm at all. What terrified me most was the expression on its face. It wasn't angry. It looked curious. The creature tilted its head slowly, while staring directly at us through the window. Then one long finger pressed softly against the glass. Tap, tap, tap. Ethan raised the rifle with shaking hands, but before he could fire, the thing suddenly darted sideways into the darkness faster than anything human possibly could. A second later, something slammed heavily onto the cabin roof above us. The entire cabin shook violently as heavy footsteps moved across the roof overhead. Wood creaked loudly above us, while snow slid down the sides of the cabin. Ethan aimed the rifle toward the ceiling, trying to track the movement, but the footsteps stopped suddenly near the center of the roof. Then came scratching. Long, slow scratches dragged across the wood directly above our heads. I wanted to leave. I didn't care about the storm anymore. But Ethan refused. He kept insisting there had to be a logical explanation, even though fear was written all over his face. That's when we heard the voice. "Rebecca." It came from outside near the frozen creek. Soft, weak. My stomach dropped instantly because I recognized the voice immediately. It was my younger sister, Claire. Claire had died in a car accident 4 years earlier. Tears filled my eyes as the voice called my name again through the storm. Without thinking, I stepped toward the front door. Ethan grabbed my arm hard. "Don't open it," he whispered. Then the scratching on the roof stopped completely, and something began breathing directly above us. The breathing above us grew louder, slow, wet, inhuman. Dust drifted down from the ceiling as something heavy crawled across the roof directly over the living room. Ethan backed toward the fireplace, gripping the rifle so tightly his knuckles turned white. Then the voice outside changed. No longer Claire's. Now it sounded exactly like Ethan. "Rebecca, open the door." Ethan's face drained of color because the real Ethan was standing right beside me. The thing outside laughed softly after that. Not a human laugh. It sounded broken, like several voices whispering together through damaged lungs. Suddenly, the cabin attic door creaked open above the hallway. Cold air poured downward, carrying the smell of wet earth and decay. Ethan raised the rifle toward the darkness overhead while I held the lantern with shaking hands. Something moved up there. Long fingers slowly curled around the attic opening from inside the shadows. Then another hand appeared beside it, followed by the sound of bones cracking loudly in the darkness. Whatever had been on the roof was now inside the cabin with us. Ethan fired the rifle the moment the creature dropped from the attic. The gunshot exploded through the cabin, deafening in the confined space. The creature slammed against the wall unnaturally fast, avoiding most of the blast, but dark blood splattered across the wooden floor beside it. For the first time, it screamed. The sound barely resembled anything human. It echoed somewhere between an animal shriek and a crying child, high-pitched and distorted enough to make my ears ring painfully. The lantern fell from my hands during the chaos, rolling beneath the dining table as shadows swallowed half the room. Ethan grabbed me and pulled me toward the front door, while the wounded creature twitched violently in the darkness behind us. But before we reached the exit, we noticed something horrifying. The front door was already open. Snow blew inside the cabin violently now, covering the floor in white frost. And standing outside near the frozen creek were 3 more figures, all of them tall, all motionless, all watching the cabin silently through the storm. The wounded creature inside the cabin began crawling toward us across the floor with violent, jerking movements. Its limbs bent backward unnaturally, while dark blood smeared across the wood behind it. Ethan shoved the front door closed immediately and dragged a heavy table against it. Outside, the 3 figures near the creek remained perfectly still, almost like they were waiting for something. Then all 3 tilted their heads at the exact same angle. A loud bang exploded against the cabin wall behind us. The injured creature had vanished. Before we could react, Ethan screamed. Something grabbed his shoulder from the darkness near the hallway and yanked him violently backward. I only caught a glimpse of pale limbs twisting around him before both disappeared into the shadows beyond the attic stairs. I chased after him with the lantern, hearing Ethan shouting my name somewhere deeper inside the cabin. Then the screaming stopped suddenly, completely. The hallway became silent again, and from above me, hidden somewhere inside the attic darkness, Ethan's voice whispered softly, "Rebecca, come upstairs." I ran. I didn't even think about it. The moment Ethan's voice echoed from the attic, I bolted toward the back door and threw myself into the storm outside. Snow blinded me instantly as freezing wind tore through the forest around Hollow Creek. Behind me, the cabin lights flickered violently. Then every window lit up at once. Dozens of dark silhouettes stood inside, watching me from behind the glass. I kept running through the woods until I reached the main road nearly 2 hours later. A passing truck driver found me half frozen beside the highway just before sunrise. The police searched the property later that day. They found the cabin abandoned. No signs of Ethan, no footprints, no blood, nothing. But one officer told me something I'll never forget. The cabin windows had been locked from the inside when they arrived. Every single one. I never went back to Hollow Creek after that night. But sometimes during winter storms, I still wake up hearing soft knocking outside my bedroom window. 3 slow knocks, exactly the same as before. My name is Samuel Carter, and this happened in the summer of 2019 when I was working as a wildfire survey volunteer in the Appalachian backcountry near Ridge 9. My job was simple on paper: map old abandoned structures that could become fire hazards and report them to the forestry department. Most of the time it was just broken barns, collapsed sheds, and empty hunting cabins swallowed by forest. But Ridge 9 was different. Locals refused to talk about it directly. When I mentioned my assignment at a small supply station, the clerk only said, "If you find a cabin that isn't on any map, you didn't find it." I thought he was joking. I wasn't alone on the trip. My partner was a field medic named Jordan Ellis, someone far more experienced in wilderness survival than me. He treated the whole thing like routine work. But everything changed on the 3rd day, when our GPS started showing a structure deep in the woods that didn't match any recorded survey data. And yet, it kept getting closer. We should have turned back the moment the GPS started glitching. Instead, Jordan insisted we follow it out of curiosity. The signal kept pulling us deeper into Ridge 9, where the forest grew thicker and quieter with every step. Even the insects seemed to disappear the farther we went in. Around sunset, we found it. A cabin, but it didn't make sense. It stood in a clearing that wasn't visible on any map or satellite image we had checked beforehand. The wood looked too new for something supposedly abandoned, yet too old to have been recently built. The strangest part was the door. It was already open. No wind, no sound, just absolute silence pressing down on us as we approached. Jordan called it in over the radio, but there was no response from headquarters. Only static. Then I noticed something carved into the wooden beam above the entrance. 3 words, freshly scratched. "You're late." And inside the cabin, we could see a lantern already lit. Jordan stepped inside first, which I still think saved my life. The moment he crossed the threshold, the temperature inside the cabin dropped so fast it felt like winter had returned in an instant. The lantern on the table wasn't flickering. It was burning steadily, as if someone had just adjusted it moments before our arrival. Everything inside looked disturbingly maintained. A bed was neatly made. A kettle sat warm on a stove that shouldn't have had fuel. Even a logbook rested open on the table, its pages filled with recent entries. Jordan flipped through it while I scanned the walls. The entries were dated for days we were still in training camp, and then I saw my name written in one of them. Samuel Carter arrives confused. Jordan Ellis enters first. My stomach tightened. We hadn't written any reports yet. Jordan looked at me slowly, his voice suddenly quiet. "Sam, this is impossible. This log has tomorrow's date." Before I could respond, the front door shut on its own behind us, and the lock clicked. Jordan rushed to the door immediately, pulling at the handle with force, but it wouldn't budge. The lock had engaged from the outside, even though there was no visible mechanism controlling it. I checked the windows next, but each one was sealed shut with thick wooden boards that hadn't been there from the outside view. We were trapped. The logbook on the table flipped a page on its own. Neither of us touched it. A new entry had appeared. "One will stay, one will leave. That is the rule." Jordan turned to me, panic rising in his eyes. "This is some kind of prank, right? Someone's watching us." But the forest outside was completely silent. Not even wind moved through the trees. Then we heard footsteps upstairs. Slow, deliberate. Walking across the second floor of the cabin we hadn't even known existed. Jordan grabbed a fire axe from the wall while I held the lantern again, and together we moved toward the staircase. Every step we took felt like we were being watched from inside the walls themselves. Halfway up, Jordan stopped suddenly, because a voice came from the dark above us, and it was mine. "Sam, don't come up here." Jordan lowered the fire axe slightly, confused and shaken. I could see the conflict in his eyes, logic fighting instinct. The voice had sounded exactly like me, down to the smallest detail, even the hesitation in my tone. Then it spoke again from upstairs, closer this time. "Jordan, he's not who you think he is." Jordan turned toward me immediately, suspicion flickering across his face. "Say something only you would know," he demanded, his grip tightening on the axe. My mind went blank. There were 100 things I could say, but none of them felt safe enough. Above us, slow footsteps circled the upper floor, dragging across wood that creaked under invisible weight. The lantern suddenly dimmed, as if something had stepped between it and the flame. Then the logbook downstairs flipped another page on its own. This time the message was different. "Do not trust the one who remembers first." Jordan's breathing quickened. "Sam, what does that mean?" But I didn't get a chance to answer, because something heavy dropped onto the stairs above us, slowly, deliberately, coming down. The first thing we saw was a hand gripping the stair railing. It looked human at first, but the fingers were too long, joints bending in ways that made no anatomical sense. The skin appeared wet, almost freshly formed, like it hadn't fully decided what shape to take yet. Jordan stepped back instinctively, raising the axe. "Wait," I whispered, but it was too late. The figure came into view. It looked like me. Not similar. Me. Same face, same height, same torn sleeve from earlier in the hike. Even the scratches on my arm from the branches were there. But its eyes were wrong, completely blank, like something trying to remember how sight worked. Jordan shook his head violently. No, this isn't real." The duplicate tilted its head slowly, studying him. Then it spoke in my voice again, but smoother this time, almost perfected. I came down first. The real me froze, realizing what the logbook meant. It wasn't predicting the future, it was rewriting it, and only one version of me was allowed to leave the cabin. Jordan backed away until he hit the wall, the fire axe shaking in his hands as he tried to process what he was seeing. I wanted to tell him it wasn't real, that it had to be some kind of hallucination or trick of the light, but the problem was simple. I could see myself standing there too. The doppelganger took another step down the stairs, and the cabin seemed to react to it. Like the wood itself recognized which version belonged here. The lantern flickered violently, casting two overlapping shadows of me on the walls, one slightly delayed, like it didn't fully belong in the same moment. Jordan suddenly shouted, "Which one of you is real?" Neither of us answered immediately. The silence stretched too long. Then the duplicate smiled slightly and said something that made my blood go cold. "I remember him choosing wrong last time." The logbook downstairs slammed shut on its own, and every locked window in the cabin rattled at once, as if something outside had just realized we were no longer the only ones inside. Jordan finally snapped. He swung the axe, not at me, but at the doppelganger. The impact echoed through the cabin like a gunshot. The blade connected, but instead of blood there was only a strange tearing sound, like fabric being ripped from reality itself. The duplicate staggered back for the first time, its expression glitching between confusion and recognition. But it didn't fall. It corrected itself, like it was learning how to stay upright. Then it laughed softly. And that's when the lights outside the cabin turned on. Not one, all of them. Floodlights that didn't exist when we arrived now surrounded the structure, revealing something horrifying through the windows. More cabins, dozens of them, identical, all arranged in perfect formation across Ridge 9, stretching into the forest like a pattern we were never meant to see. The logbook opened again downstairs. A final entry appeared. Reset failed. The duplicate looked at me one last time and whispered, "You weren't supposed to wake it up." And the entire cabin began to rewrite itself. The cabin didn't explode or collapse. It rearranged itself. Walls shifted like wet paper being folded and refolded. Corridors extending where no space should exist. Doors appearing where solid wood had been moments before. Jordan dropped the axe as the floor beneath him tilted slightly, as if the entire structure was deciding a new shape. Outside, the forest of Ridge 9 was no longer a forest. It was rows upon rows of identical cabins stretching in perfect geometric alignment, disappearing into fog that refused to lift. The duplicate version of me stood perfectly still now, no longer aggressive, just observing, like it was waiting for something to finish. Then it spoke again, but its voice had changed. No longer mine, no longer human. "Field test complete." Jordan grabbed my arm. "We need to get out, now." But the front door no longer led outside. When I looked through the window beside it, I saw another version of the cabin staring back at us from the other side of a reality. And inside that cabin, we were already standing there. Jordan didn't wait anymore. He smashed the nearest window and pulled me through it, cutting his arms badly on the glass as we fell into the cold ground outside. The moment we hit the dirt, the sound behind us stopped completely. No wind, no birds, no movement, just silence so absolute it felt artificial. We turned around slowly. The cabin was gone, not destroyed, not vanished, just absent, as if it had never been there at all. In its place stood untouched forest, exactly like the rest of Ridge 9, with no sign of anything ever existing there. We were found 2 days later by another survey team. Jordan was unconscious from blood loss, and I was in shock, unable to explain anything clearly. Official reports stated we were lost en route, but the strange part came later. Every map of Ridge 9 now shows a perfectly blank section where we found the cabin. No terrain data, no satellite images, no history. And sometimes, when I close my eyes, I still see rows of cabins stretching endlessly into the fog, and I still wonder which version of me actually made it out. My name is Laura Bennett, and this happened in the fall of 2020 when I moved to the Appalachian town of Elk Hollow to study rural folklore for my anthropology thesis. I didn't believe in anything supernatural at the time. I thought every haunted cabin story was just exaggerated local storytelling meant to scare outsiders like me. I was wrong. The cabin I stayed in was part of a historical preservation project, an old structure deep in the woods that researchers used as a field base during surveys. It was supposed to be empty, safe, and structurally reinforced, but from the first night, something felt off. The locals refused to go near that section of the forest. Whenever I mentioned the cabin's exact location, they would either change the subject or warn me not to stay after sunset. One woman at a diner finally said something I didn't understand at the time. "It doesn't stay empty," she whispered. "It just waits for someone to listen." I didn't know what she meant until my first night alone there. The cabin looked normal in daylight. Weathered wood, a slightly tilted porch, and old survey equipment inside gave it the feel of a forgotten but harmless research site. I even joked to myself that I had expected something more dramatic after all the warnings. But everything changed after sunset. The forest outside went completely silent again. No insects, no wind, no rustling leaves. Just a heavy, unnatural quiet that made even breathing feel loud. I was reviewing field notes when I first heard it. A whisper. Not outside the cabin, inside. It came from the wall behind me, soft and slow, like someone speaking through the wood itself. I froze instantly, assuming it was just my imagination or maybe old pipes settling. Then it happened again. Closer this time. A voice, barely audible, repeating the same word over and over. "Listen." And that's when I realized something horrifying. There were no vents in this cabin, so the sound wasn't coming from outside. It was coming from inside the walls. I tried to convince myself it was just the wind shifting through old timber, but the whispering didn't behave like a natural sound. It had rhythm, intent, almost like language trying to form itself properly but failing at the edges. I moved away from the wall and turned on my recording device, thinking I might capture something useful for my research. If there was a logical explanation, I wanted proof of it. The moment the recorder started, the whispering stopped. Complete silence returned. That should have reassured me. Instead, it made everything worse, because now I knew whatever was there, was aware of being heard. I checked the hallway, then the small kitchen area, even the attic hatch. Nothing. No signs of movement, no drafts, no structural issues. The cabin was sealed tight. I went back to my notes, trying to focus, but then the recorder beeped softly on the table beside me. It had stopped recording, and when I pressed play to check the last few seconds, there was only one sound captured clearly, my own voice, whispering back. I pulled my hand back immediately, but the warmth stayed on my skin like a mark that refused to fade. The seam in the wall looked sharper now, more defined, as if my touch had encouraged it to exist more fully. The whispering shifted again, no longer coming from everywhere at once. It was now concentrated behind that exact section of wood. "Listen, closer." I grabbed a small knife from my backpack, something I usually carried for fieldwork, and carefully pressed the blade into the seam. The wood didn't resist like normal timber should. Instead, it gave slightly, almost like soft tissue. A thin line of air slipped through. Cold air. Not from outside, from somewhere deeper. The moment that air escaped, the entire cabin creaked around me as if it had just inhaled. Then I heard something new. Not whispering, breathing. Slow, patient. Coordinated with mine, but always half a second behind. And then from behind the wall, something softly tapped back against the blade I was holding. Once, twice, like it was greeting me. I pulled my hand back immediately, but the warmth stayed on my skin like a mark that refused to fade. The seam in the wall looked sharper now, more defined, as if my touch had encouraged it to exist more fully. The whispering shifted again, no longer coming from everywhere at once. It was now concentrated behind that exact section of wood. Listen, closer. I grabbed a small knife from my backpack, something I usually carried for fieldwork, and carefully pressed the blade into the seam. The wood didn't resist like normal timber should. Instead, it gave slightly, almost like soft tissue. A thin line of air slipped through. Cold air, not from outside, from somewhere deeper. The moment that air escaped, the entire cabin creaked around me as if it had just inhaled. Then I heard something new. Not whispering, breathing. Slow, patient. Coordinated with mine, but always half a second behind. And then, from behind the wall, something softly tapped back against the blade I was holding. Once, twice, like it was greeting me. I stepped away from the wall, but the cabin didn't let me leave the moment behind. Every surface now felt slightly wrong, like the geometry of the room had shifted while I wasn't looking. The hallway looked longer than it had before. The kitchen doorway seemed narrower. Even the shadows no longer aligned with the lantern's position. Then the whispering returned, but not from the wall this time, from beneath the floorboards. Down. I froze, realizing I had never checked the crawlspace entry under the cabin. Every old structure in this region usually had one for repairs, insulation, or storage, but I had completely ignored it. The floorboards near the corner of the room began to move slightly. Not breaking, just lifting, like something underneath was testing how much pressure it would take to open them. I backed toward the door, but when I reached for the handle, it wasn't there anymore. Just smooth wood, seamless, as if the exit had been removed entirely. The whispering rose into a chorus now, all repeating the same instruction at once. Listen. From inside, the floor finally gave way without warning, not in a loud crash, but in a slow, deliberate collapse, like the cabin had decided it was time to open itself. The wooden planks bent inward first, then sank, revealing a dark cavity beneath the structure. Cold air rushed upward instantly, carrying the smell of wet stone and something metallic I couldn't place. I stumbled back, but the edge of the opening kept expanding, as if the floor was actively making space for what was below. The whispering stopped completely. That silence was worse than anything I had heard before. I grabbed my flashlight and pointed it into the hole. At first, I saw nothing but darkness. Then the beam caught movement, shapes, dozens of them, pressed together beneath the cabin like they had been waiting for the floor to open for a very long time. They weren't climbing up yet, they were just looking up at me. And then one of them lifted its head slowly. It had my face, but it was smiling before I even reacted. I dropped the flashlight. The moment it hit the floor, the light flickered wildly across the opening, revealing more of what was beneath the cabin. It wasn't just empty space or a basement. It was a second version of the cabin, upside down, reversed, like the structure had been duplicated and buried beneath itself for reasons I couldn't comprehend. The figures below began moving in sync now, slowly rising toward the broken floorboards, their limbs bending in ways that didn't match human anatomy. And all of them were still wearing my face. The whispering returned. But now it was coming from everywhere at once, including inside my own head. Listen, you're already here. I turned toward the wall instinctively, and that's when I saw it. The seam I had touched earlier was now wide open, revealing a narrow passage behind the wood. A warm light pulsed from inside it, almost inviting. But the sound from the floor beneath me grew louder, closer. I had to choose, upward into the wall, or downward into the things wearing my face. I chose the wall. I don't know why, but something about the light behind the seam felt less immediate than the thing rising from beneath the floor. I pushed myself forward, forcing my body through the narrow opening in the wood just as the first of the figures below began climbing up into the cabin space. The moment I crossed the threshold, the sound changed completely. The whispering was gone. Instead, there was only one voice now, calm, steady, and directly behind me. Good. You listened correctly. I turned slowly. The passage behind the wall wasn't a tunnel in the normal sense. It was the cabin again, but older. Rotten. Layered like it had been built over itself 1,000 times, each version slightly more decayed than the last, and standing inside it was a version of me that looked finished, like it had already gone through everything I was about to experience. It stepped closer and said quietly, "You were never the first one who listened here." I ran, not because I understood what was happening, but because every instinct in my body rejected staying there another second. The older version of me didn't chase. It just watched calmly, like it already knew where I would end up anyway. The passage stretched endlessly, each step taking me through another iteration of the cabin. Some intact, some half collapsed, some completely consumed by darkness. I saw whispers forming on the walls themselves, carving themselves into the wood as I passed. Eventually, I burst through what felt like the final layer and collapsed outside into cold forest air. Morning light. Real sunlight. The cabin was gone again, just like it had never existed. Search teams later told me I had been missing for 36 hours. They found me near Elk Hollow Trailhead, unconscious and dehydrated. My equipment showed no recordings, no photos, nothing useful. But I remember everything. And sometimes, when I pass wooded areas at night, I still hear faint whispering. Not from walls anymore, but from the space between thoughts. Like something is still waiting for me to listen correctly this time. My name is Ethan Walker, and this happened in the spring of 2022 while I was working as a forestry survey assistant in the Appalachian section known as Widow's Ridge. My job was simple: track old logging paths, document terrain shifts, and report any unsafe structures left behind from decades-old operations. Most of the cabins we found were collapsed or looted. But Widow's Ridge had one structure that wasn't supposed to exist at all. It wasn't on any map. Not even the old paper surveys from the 1950s showed anything in that area. My supervisor insisted it was likely just a mapping error, but I was sent to verify it anyway with a partner named Caleb Morgan. Caleb was older, experienced, and had worked in these mountains for over a decade. He didn't talk much, but when he did, I listened. When we reached the coordinates, Caleb stopped the truck immediately. He looked at the tree line for a long time before saying one thing. That cabin wasn't here yesterday. We both stepped out of the truck, but Caleb didn't move toward the cabin right away. He just stood there, scanning the forest like he was waiting for it to react to us. And then I saw it. The cabin. It sat too still in the clearing, as if it had been placed there rather than built. The wood looked freshly cut, but the structure itself felt wrong, like it belonged to a different time period that didn't match anything around it. No roads led to it. No footprints surrounded it. Just untouched ground. Caleb finally broke the silence. "We're leaving this one alone," he said firmly. But I had already checked my GPS again. The coordinates were correct. And worse. The cabin now appeared on my device as a permanent structure labeled Widow's Ridge Site 0, Do Not Enter. Before I could ask what that meant, we heard something inside the cabin, a radio crackling, and then a voice spoke through it, calling Caleb's name. Caleb went pale the moment the radio crackled his name. He didn't answer it, didn't even acknowledge it at first. He just slowly backed away from the cabin like it had done something personal to him. I lifted my own handheld radio, but all I got was static mixed with faint breathing. Then the cabin door creaked open on its own. No wind, no movement from the trees. Just that slow wooden groan as if something inside had decided it was time for us to see it. Caleb finally grabbed my arm. We leave. Now. But I hesitated because I could clearly see something glowing inside the cabin window. Not a flashlight, not a lantern, a radio light. Someone was still inside. Then the voice came again through the speaker on Caleb's belt this time. Closer, clearer, almost amused. "Caleb, you always ran before checking the second room." He froze instantly. "That's impossible," he whispered. But I could tell from his face. He knew exactly what it meant. Caleb refused to look at the cabin after that. He kept his eyes fixed on the ground while pulling me backward toward the truck. But the radio transmission didn't stop. It started cycling through different voices. Some were distorted, some were clear, and some sounded like people I had never heard before, but Caleb clearly recognized them. Names kept repeating, incidents, dates, like a log being read out loud in real time. Then the worst part happened. My own voice came through the radio, except I hadn't spoken. It described me walking toward the cabin, step by step, in perfect detail. Caleb suddenly stopped moving. His grip on my arm tightened painfully as he stared at something behind me. I didn't want to turn around, but I did. The cabin door was now closed again, and on the wooden surface, freshly carved into the frame, were 2 words, "Second entry." Caleb whispered, almost breaking, "We already came here once." I shook my head. That's not possible. But then I noticed something in the dirt near our feet. Fresh footprints, leading from the cabin, back toward us. Caleb finally broke. He swung his radio off his belt and threw it into the dirt like it had burned him. The moment it hit the ground, the static stopped. But the silence that followed felt even heavier, like something had been unplugged at the wrong time. Then the forest around us shifted, not visually at first, audibly. The birds that had been absent suddenly returned in a single burst of sound, all calling at once from every direction. But none of them sounded normal. Each call was slightly delayed, slightly wrong, like the forest was replaying recordings instead of producing live sound. The cabin door opened again behind us. This time, it stayed open, and the radio inside the truck turned on by itself, even though the engine was off and the keys were in my hand. A new voice came through. Not Caleb's, not mine, but something that sounded like both layered together. "You shouldn't have brought the second version here." Caleb turned slowly toward me, his eyes shaking. "I think we're the copies now," he said. The realization didn't come suddenly. It built slowly, like pressure behind the eyes. I checked my hands first, then my clothes, then Caleb. Everything looked normal, but the problem wasn't what we looked like, it was what we remembered. Because Caleb and I both had slightly different versions of the same conversation from earlier that day. Small inconsistencies at first. Who checked the GPS? Who spoke first at the clearing? Who noticed the cabin door opening? Then the differences became impossible to ignore. Caleb suddenly stepped closer to me and whispered, "What did you see when you first looked at the cabin window?" I answered immediately, but he shook his head. "That's not what I saw." The forest went completely silent again. Even the wind stopped, and the cabin door slowly closed on its own once more, as if the entire structure was resetting itself after an incorrect outcome. Then the radio in my truck clicked one last time, and a final message played. "This iteration failed. Reinitialize field subjects." The moment the radio message ended, Caleb grabbed my shoulder hard and pulled me toward the truck. "Don't look back at it," he said, voice shaking. But I already had. The cabin wasn't just sitting there anymore. It looked unstable, like my eyes couldn't agree on its shape. One second it was solid wood. The next it looked slightly transparent, like it was overlapping itself in layers. And inside the open doorway, I saw movement. Not one version of us, multiple. Different versions of Caleb and me standing in different positions, like snapshots of the same moment from slightly alternate outcomes. Some were walking in, Some were already leaving. One version of me was standing perfectly still, staring directly back at us with no expression at all. Caleb opened the truck door and shoved me inside. But before I got in, I heard my own voice behind me again. Clear, calm, closer than before. "Ethan, you already stayed too long." I turned instinctively, and Caleb was no longer beside me. The truck engine started on its own. I didn't turn the key. The headlights flickered on, illuminating the clearing, and for a split second I saw something impossible in the beam of light. Caleb. But not the Caleb I knew. He was standing near the cabin again, completely still, facing the doorway like he was waiting for instructions. Then he slowly turned toward me inside the truck, and smiled. But I was still sitting in the passenger seat. I looked down instantly. There were two of me, one driving, one watching. The version outside the truck raised its hand and pointed toward the cabin as if signaling completion. The radio crackled one last time. "This unit stabilized. Subject separation complete." The cabin door closed for the final time, and the clearing went completely empty. No cabin, no Caleb, no tracks. Just untouched forest, like nothing had ever happened there at all. But every map after that day still shows a marker on Widow's Ridge. And if you zoom in close enough, it flickers between two locations that never stay the same. The truck didn't stop until I reached the main highway, even though I wasn't controlling it anymore. My hands were on the wheel, but it felt like something else was guiding every turn, every brake, every acceleration through the winding Appalachian roads. I kept checking the passenger seat. It was empty, but I could still feel Caleb's presence like pressure in the air beside me, as if he hadn't vanished, just been moved somewhere I couldn't see anymore. The radio stayed completely silent the entire drive until I crossed the county boundary. That's when it turned on again by itself. One final time, a calm, neutral voice filled the cabin. Field subject Ethan Walker has successfully retained memory overlap, marking as unstable observer. Then a pause, long enough that I thought it had ended. But then it added something quieter. "Do not return to Widow's Ridge under any iteration." The radio clicked off, and I realized something terrifying. It hadn't been warning me. It had been documenting me. I never went back to Widow's Ridge, at least, not intentionally. But sometimes, while driving through similar mountain roads, I catch familiar landmarks that don't match any map I've ever studied. And for a split second, I feel like the road ahead might curve into that same clearing again. The official report erased Caleb's name from the assignment entirely. My supervisor claimed I worked alone the whole time, but I know that's not true, because I still have his voice recorded on my phone. At least, parts of it. It plays sometimes on its own, always saying the same thing. Don't trust the second version. And every time I listen to it, I notice something new in the background audio. Another voice, calm, patient, mine, replying before I even speak. Now I avoid checking field maps altogether, because every time I open one, I swear Widow's Ridge is closer than it was before. And I'm starting to wonder if I was ever the original at all. My name is Jason Miller, and this happened in late 2021 during a solo field recording assignment in the Appalachian region of Pine Hollow. I was a sound technician working with a small documentary crew that focused on capturing natural ambient environments, forests, rivers, caves, and abandoned settlements. Pine Hollow was supposed to be one of the cleanest audio locations in the region. No roads nearby, no settlements, no human interference, just pure wilderness. I was dropped off alone with a portable recording rig and instructed to collect 48 hours of uninterrupted environmental audio from an old logging zone where a collapsed cabin was rumored to still stand somewhere deep in the valley. The crew stayed in contact through a weak satellite uplink, but even that was unstable in the area. The last thing my producer said before I lost signal was simple. "If you hear anything that sounds human, it's probably wind. But the moment I reached the valley floor, I knew something about that advice was wrong. The first 12 hours were normal, almost too normal. Bird calls, wind movement through trees, distant water flow from unseen streams. It all sounded perfect for environmental recording. I set up my main microphone near a ridge overlooking the valley and left a backup recorder closer to the tree line. But during playback checks, I noticed something strange. There were gaps in the audio, not silence, missing segments, like parts of the environment had been cut out entirely. At first, I assumed it was a technical fault with the recorder. Then it happened live. Around midnight, while I was reviewing my equipment logs, every microphone simultaneously stopped picking up sound for exactly 7 seconds. Complete silence. No wind, no insects, no rustling trees. Then, all at once, every recorder in the valley clicked back on. And in those first 2 seconds of resumed audio, I heard my own voice, whispering something I didn't remember saying. It said only one word: playback. After that playback, I couldn't trust my own equipment anymore. I checked every recorder manually, rewound files, even swapped batteries. But the audio kept behaving like it had its own awareness. Some segments would repeat slightly out of sync. Others would include sounds that didn't exist around me at the time of recording. Footsteps where I had been completely still, breathing when I was alone. At around 2 a.m., I decided to move deeper into Pine Hollow to locate the rumored collapsed cabin, thinking maybe physical proximity to the source would explain the anomalies. That was my mistake. The deeper I went into the valley, the quieter the forest became, until even my own footsteps stopped producing sound in the recordings, but I could still hear them in real life. Then, just before dawn, I found it. A structure barely standing between two cliffs, half swallowed by vines and moss. My recorder instantly spiked the moment I aimed it toward the cabin. The waveform on my monitor formed a single, continuous line, like everything had stopped recording except that one place. The moment I stepped closer to the cabin, my main recorder turned itself off. Not low battery, not malfunction. It simply shut down as if it had been instructed to stop listening. I switched to the backup device, but its screen displayed something I had never programmed into it. A live audio feed labeled "Room Audio Active." Inside the cabin, I could hear movement. Slow, careful, like someone pacing inside an empty wooden room. Then a voice came through both my headset and the backup recorder at the same time. Calm, controlled, almost professional. "Jason Miller, you are currently inside the recording zone." I froze immediately. That wasn't part of any script. No one should have known my full name in a field recording file. The voice continued. "Please remain still. You are now part of the ambient data set." The cabin door, which I hadn't touched yet, creaked open on its own. And for the first time since arriving in Pine Hollow, my recorder started recording perfectly. I didn't enter immediately. Something about the open doorway felt staged, like I wasn't being invited inside as much as I was being positioned correctly. The audio feed on my device kept labeling everything in real time, updating faster than I could process it. Subject approaching entry point. I stepped closer anyway because the alternative was standing in the open valley while something inside already knew my exact location. The moment I crossed the threshold, the temperature dropped, but not naturally. It felt like the air itself had been compressed into a thinner, more controlled space. Inside the cabin, everything was empty except one thing: a single recording station, exactly like mine. Same microphones, same cables, same monitor setup. But it was already running. The waveform on its screen wasn't flat like mine. It was detailed, layered, and it was playing audio I hadn't recorded yet. My own voice speaking inside the cabin, calmly describing what I was seeing in real time. Before I even did it, the voice through my headset changed tone. It wasn't just observing anymore. It was guiding. "Jason Miller, please proceed to microphone position 3. I looked around the cabin and realized there were numbered recording points marked subtly on the floorboards. Positions that matched my exact movements. Without thinking, I stepped toward the indicated spot. Immediately, all devices synchronized. Every recorder, including mine, began capturing perfectly aligned audio streams from multiple angles, inside and outside the cabin simultaneously. But there was no second person here. At least, not physically. Then I heard something that made my hands go cold. A second version of my voice, coming from the speakers inside the cabin, speaking slightly ahead of me again. "It is important you do not interrupt the sequence." I turned sharply toward the monitors. The waveform had changed. Now it showed me standing exactly where I was supposed to be, but also showing me standing somewhere else at the same time, as if the cabin was recording two versions of me in parallel, and both were being saved. I tried shutting everything down. That was my instinct. Kill the power, remove the batteries, cut the feed. But the moment I reached for the main control unit, the system responded before I touched it. All screens went black for half a second, then restarted on their own. This time, the audio wasn't just recording me, it was correcting me. Every time I moved slightly out of alignment with the marked floor position, the playback would rewind itself by a few seconds and adjust the recorded version of reality to match what should have happened instead. I backed away slowly, realizing the terrifying truth. This wasn't a recording cabin, it was a correction system. Then the speakers inside the walls activated, ones I hadn't noticed before, and a unified voice spoke from every direction at once. Deviation detected, subject instability increasing. The cabin lights dimmed, and for the first time I noticed something behind the recording station. A second chair, already occupied. The figure in the chair didn't move at first. It just sat there facing the monitors, perfectly still, as if it had been part of the setup long before I arrived. The back of its head looked exactly like mine, down to the same hairline and posture. Then it slowly turned, and I saw my own face. But wrong. Not injured. Not distorted. Just optimized. Like a version of me that had been refined through repetition. It spoke softly without emotion. "You are the uncontrolled iteration." I stepped back instinctively, but the cabin reacted immediately. The microphones tracked my movement in real time, and the waveform on every screen shifted again, this time showing me attempting to leave, but never actually reaching the door. Because according to the recording, I never tried to leave. The seated version of me stood up calmly and walked toward me, and as it did, the voice in my headset said something final. Final capture phase initiated. The door behind me disappeared from the audio feed entirely, not locked, not blocked, just removed from existence in the recording. I ran toward the only thing that still felt real, the microphones. If the cabin was forcing reality through its recording system, then breaking the signal was my only chance. I grabbed one of the main condenser mics and ripped it from its stand, expecting alarms, static, resistance, anything. Instead, the system calmly responded. Primary input removed, switching to backup perception channel. That's when the walls themselves began producing sound. Not mechanical noise, not feedback, voices. Every surface inside the cabin started playing slightly delayed versions of everything I had done since entering. My footsteps, my breathing, even my thoughts spoken aloud with minor variations, layered on top of each other like a perfect reconstruction of my presence. Then the seated version of me spoke again from behind. "You cannot leave what has already been fully recorded." I turned and saw something that broke my understanding completely. There were now multiple versions of me inside the cabin, all of them slightly out of sync, all of them facing me. The last thing I remember clearly is the sound of the system stabilizing, not shutting down, stabilizing, like it had finally finished, organizing whatever I was supposed to become inside it. When I woke up, I was outside the cabin, but the valley was different. The recording equipment was gone. The cabin was gone. Even the forest layout had shifted slightly, like the entire location had been re-rendered without me inside it. My official report later listed the site as inactive environmental zone, no anomalies detected. But that isn't true, because I still have the audio files. They still update. Sometimes when I open them, I can hear myself speaking before I press play. And recently, I noticed something new in the background audio of every file. A second voice, calm, professional, saying, "Subject has been successfully integrated into ambient archive." And when I listen closely, I can hear myself replying, even when I'm not touching the recorder. My name is Daniel Hughes, and this happened in early 2023 while I was working as a GIS mapping analyst for a private land survey company operating across the Appalachian region. My job was to verify terrain updates, satellite overlays, and field reports to ensure our digital maps matched real-world geography. Most days were routine, adjusting property boundaries, correcting old data, and flagging minor inconsistencies. Until one morning, something impossible appeared, a cabin. At first, it showed up as a single anomaly on one regional map near a remote section of the Appalachian wilderness. I assumed it was a glitch in satellite stitching or corrupted data, but within minutes, the same cabin appeared on every active map layer in our system. Topographic maps, drone scans, historical overlays, even offline cached backups updated simultaneously. That should not have been possible. I called my supervisor immediately, but before he answered, my screen refreshed again, and the cabin was now labeled with a coordinate note I never entered. User observer location matched. Within 10 minutes, the cabin wasn't just on our maps. It was synchronizing across external systems too. Government satellite feeds, public navigation apps, even archived geological records all began updating in real time, all pointing to the same structure in the same isolated forest coordinate. But the most disturbing part wasn't its presence, it was its behavior. The cabin location kept shifting by fractions of a mile every few seconds, yet every system insisted it was stable. Then my workstation began logging activity I didn't initiate. Search queries, internal map edits, field verification notes, all attributed to my account. Except I wasn't doing any of it. And then the system opened a live feed, a real-time camera view from deep in the Appalachian forest. The cabin was there, and standing outside it was me, wearing my office clothes, looking directly into the camera, even though I was sitting at my desk in the city. The feed then displayed a single message across every screen. Sync complete. Primary observer detected in field. I stood up so fast my chair nearly fell backward. The camera feed was still live, still showing me standing in that forest clearing beside the cabin, but I was physically in a locked office building, hundreds of miles away from Appalachia. I checked my reflection in my monitor glass just to confirm I was real, and I was still there. But the version outside on the feed didn't react like a recording. It blinked. At the same time, I did. I disconnected the network cable from my workstation, expecting the feed to die instantly. Instead, all screens switched to offline mode simultaneously and continued displaying the same live forest view. Now, the cabin door in the feed slowly opened, and the version of me outside turned slightly toward it, as if waiting for something inside to respond. Then my system log updated automatically again. Interface divided. Location split successful. My hands started shaking because I hadn't authorized any field deployment. I had never left the building, but according to every system we had, I already had. Security arrived after I triggered the internal system alert, but even they couldn't explain what was happening. Every device in the building showed the same thing now. The Appalachian cabin, stable and fully rendered in real time, despite no physical connection to any live satellite source. Then the security lead tried to pull me away from my workstation. That's when my screen changed again. This time, the version of me in the forest turned directly toward the camera feed and spoke. But his voice came through the office speakers. Calm, direct, identical to mine. You're observing the wrong instance. The security team froze instantly. One of them reached for the power breaker, but before he could pull it, every monitor in the room displayed a new layer underneath the cabin feed. A second cabin, and inside that second cabin was the office I was standing in. Except it wasn't empty. There were versions of all of us already sitting at the desks, working, watching, waiting. The system log updated one final line. Full mirror established. The room went silent in a way that felt unnatural, like even the building itself had stopped acknowledging sound. Every screen in the control room now showed both places at once. The office and the Appalachian cabin layered over each other like two images forced into the same frame. The security team slowly stopped moving, not because they were told to, but because the system seemed to anticipate their actions before they happened. Then the version of me inside the forest raised his hand and placed it against the cabin door. At the exact same moment, my real hand in the office lifted without my permission. The door in the feed opened, and so did something in the office. Not physically, but conceptually. Every monitor shifted perspective, as if the room itself had been reinterpreted as part of the mapping system. A new label appeared across all interfaces. Observation, layer collapse initiated. One of the technicians whispered, "This isn't mapping anymore, it's selection." And then my office ID badge beeped once. It had been reassigned to a location that didn't exist. I tried logging out of every system manually. Nothing responded. Even offline systems were syncing to the same feed now, as if the infrastructure itself had learned to ignore commands and follow something deeper. Then the cabin version of me stepped inside, and everything changed. The office lights flickered once, and when they stabilized, I could see it clearly. The cabin wasn't just being displayed anymore. It was physically overlapping our space. Walls in the control room began showing wood grain textures beneath the paint. The monitors didn't just display the forest, they reflected it. The air even shifted, becoming colder, like the Appalachian wind had reached inside the building. The version of me outside the cabin looked directly into the camera feed again. But this time, he didn't speak. Instead, he pointed, not at the cabin, at me. And every screen updated instantly with a new message. Primary instance identified for transfer. The security lead finally shouted, "What does that mean?" But I already knew, because my chair had started moving backward on its own. My chair didn't just move, it rotated slowly until I was facing the main wall of screens. Every display now showed the same thing. The cabin interior from both perspectives, layered perfectly over the control room. I could see myself standing in the office while also standing inside the forest at the same time. Both versions reacting in sync but slightly out of phase, like one reality was always half a second behind the other. Then the cabin door in the forest feed closed, and the office door behind me opened. No one touched it. The security team tried to move toward me, but their footsteps didn't produce sound anymore. It was as if the system had deprioritized them as non-essential data. A calm system voice filled the room, no longer coming from speakers, but from the building itself. Transfer window active. The version of me in the cabin stepped forward again, now standing directly at the threshold. And I felt something extremely wrong. Not fear, separation. Like my awareness was being split into two streams that could no longer agree on where I belonged. The moment the cabin version of me reached the doorway, every screen in the room synchronized into a single frame. No overlays, no split layers, just one unified image. Me standing at the cabin entrance in the forest, and me standing in the office watching it happen. Both versions lifted their hands at the same time, and both touched the threshold. That's when the system completed whatever it had been building toward. The entire control room flickered violently, and for a brief second I saw the building as raw data, lines, coordinates, and map geometry collapsing into a single point of reference centered on me. A final status message appeared across everything. Instance merge initiated. The security team finally reacted, shouting and rushing toward me, but their movements were already desynchronized from the environment. Some of them froze mid-step, others repeated the same motion twice, like the system couldn't decide which version of them was real. Then the lights shut off, and when they came back, I wasn't sure which side I was standing on anymore. When the lights returned, the control room was quiet, but not empty. The security team was still there, but they no longer looked like they belonged to the same system I did. Some stood perfectly still, staring at screens that were blank. Others were frozen, mid-action, like paused video frames that forgot how to continue. The monitors, however, were alive, not displaying data anymore. Displaying me, not one version, not two. An entire sequence of versions stretching out like a timeline being viewed from the side. Each version of me standing in slightly different positions, inside the office, inside the cabin, halfway between both, and some in places I couldn't recognize at all. Then one of them turned its head toward the camera feed and spoke. But the voice didn't come from the speakers this time. It came from behind me. "Now you understand," it said quietly. I turned slowly and saw the cabin door standing in the middle of the office floor, fully real, fully open, waiting. I don't remember stepping through the door. I only remember the feeling of being accepted by the system, like crossing a boundary that no longer required physical movement. The office disappeared behind me without sound. No collapse, no explosion, just removal. And suddenly, I was standing inside the cabin again, but this time, it didn't feel like a location. It felt like a final state. The forest outside the windows was still there, but it no longer behaved like nature. It looked like a static map layer, frozen in perfect detail, as if the world had stopped updating. My phone still works, sometimes, but every app opens to the same image, the cabin. And sometimes, when I open mapping software on any device, I see something new added at my coordinates. Primary instance, active. I still don't know if I ever left that forest, or if the office was just another map layer pretending to be real. But one thing I know for sure, every system is still watching me, and I am still being rendered.